a group of letters that her family was in possession of from her Uncle Andrew, who mailed them home to his family in Keewatin. So we're looking forward to hearing about Uncle Andrew and his letters home. Let's welcome Sharon to the stage. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Lisa. My glasses aren't going to fit now. When I was growing up, the name Andrew came up very rarely. It was not a subject of conversation, and all I knew is that he went to war and never came home. It was not until a shoebox full of Andrew's letters came to our family did we get the sense of his story and an interest in his life. Andrew Richard Smith was born on May 12, 1922, to Wellington and Edna Smith. He was the eldest of 7 boys and was my dad Gerald's brother. He grew up in the first settled area of Keewatin, Slabtown, now called West Bay. This is the house Andrew grew up in. It's been in my family for 5 generations, and that is my granny and my dad and myself and my son in that picture. He enlisted at the age of 18 and shipped overseas in 1940, my granny and my grandpa. Andrew's family, my dad is second from the right there, the blondest kid. And there he is looking over the cliffs of Dover. The box of Andrew's letters came to our family after my granny passed away in Courtenay, BC. In his letters, he would ask about his dad fishing and hunting on Darlington Bay. In one letter, he commented, "Would I ever like to have a nice, juicy steak right now? Deer steak." In another, he says, "I sure would like to be fishing, and boy, I miss my hunting." He asked about his brothers and always sent his love, particularly to the younger ones, Glenn and Gordon. He called them Flash Gordon after the comic book hero. Another comment was, "I hope all the boys from Keewatin are fine, and say hello to all the neighbors and friends for me." He talked about visiting relatives in England while on leave. He mentioned the Keewatin boys, Casper, Robert, his Uncle Ernie, and others that were overseas with him. He was in London during some of the bombing and talked about craters as big as a house. At the end of 42, the letters became fewer, and the last letter was dated February of 1944. I noticed a change in the tone of his letters, and they had become more infrequent. He made comments about being fed up. He sounded depressed. I thought it was because of the toll of being overseas in the war for so many years. It wasn't until a month ago that I realized the full extent of his despair and the reasons for it. The pieces fell into place as I prepared for this talk. I've tried in the past to get more information on Andrew's war history, and always came up against a brick wall. What I did not realize is that in 1940, he had signed on in Winnipeg with the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada. But he finished during the war with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Although his later letters mentioned he had changed regiments, I did not make that connection. Not until my brother Dale and his wife Marcy assessed the Ancestry.ca site last Remembrance Day, they opened it up for anybody that wanted to search the war records. They spent all Remembrance Day and all of that weekend researching Andrew's war records, did the story unfold. I received those records a month ago and continued researching until I was able to determine where Andrew was, what battles he fought, and how and where he was most likely killed. Today will be the first time members of my family will hear Andrew's story. We have Dale and Marcy to thank for doing the hard work in researching the war records. As the soldiers were never allowed to discuss their training exercises, their forays, where they were, and certainly no details of their battles and of the war, I now had access to information not contained in the letters home and was able to index the dates in his letters. I learned that Andrew had been part of the raid on Dieppe, France on August 19, 1942. A steep price was paid in Dieppe. Of 503 Cameron Highlanders, there were 346 casualties, and of those, 76 were fatal. Uncle Andrew would have seen many of his friends wounded or killed during the battle. Debate over the merit of the raid continues today. Some believe that it was a useless slaughter. Others maintain it was necessary for the success of the D-Day invasion 2 years later. From the records pulled from Ancestry.ca, I got a sense of why the frequency and tone of Andrew's letters had changed. Included in his records was a psychiatric report. He had been referred because his behavior had changed. When interviewed, he spoke wildly, in a loud voice, was excited and unable to control himself. On a subsequent interview, he spoke briefly and seemed depressed and uninterested. The report noted that Andrew said, he got along fairly well in the army until after Dieppe. He claimed the officer in command gave orders which brought the men under fire, while the officer kept out of the line of fire and did not help. He said the officer was running around with a German helmet and crawling among the wounded, implying hiding. Andrew was quoted as saying, "We remember that." It seems that more upsetting to Andrew was that this officer was promoted upon return, and that during lectures the officer made cracks about the old fellows who have no guts. The officer seemed to take a dislike to the men who had been at Dieppe and would make disparaging remarks about them in front of the new reinforcements. The officer seemed to blame them for some failures. In my opinion, this officer did that to those soldiers because he knew they had seen and experienced his cowardice in Dieppe. The report quotes Andrew as saying, "I've got no more confidence after seeing things like that, and I have no respect for a man like that, and darn little confidence in the army after what I've seen." The report goes on to say it would appear that Andrew has been the victim of poor leadership and is now a thoroughly disillusioned soldier. He further states Andrew is unsuitable for the army with his present attitude. It seems clear that after Dieppe, Andrew transferred out of the Cameron Highlanders and into the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, known as the Little Black Devils. His letters at that time reference a change in regiment. The insignia on the Little Black Devils badge in Latin translates into "name by the enemy." That nickname was given by the Métis during the Northwest Rebellion in 1885 because of the dark uniforms of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Métis Query, who are those little black devils. With this new information, I was able to research where the Rifles were, their battles, and ultimately uncover the details of the last months of Uncle Andrew's life. We had always thought he was wounded on the beach during the invasion of Normandy and died a couple of months later on August 12th. That was not the case. Please note that the following information is taken from Brian A. Reed's History of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. During the invasion of Normandy, the strategic importance of the role of the Canadian troops in establishing their bridgehead and of the particular role of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles in reaching the D-Day objective in dramatically quick fashion and in holding the salient against fierce counterattacks and overwhelming odds is best summarized in a CBC radio report from war correspondent Matthew Halton in Normandy. On D-Day, according to Halton, after reading captured German documents and the transcripts of all the telephone conversations between Field Marshal Rommel and Hitler's Supreme Headquarters, Rommel told von Kluge that the Allies would be driven into the sea by nightfall. On June 7, when asked why this had not been accomplished, Rommel reported there were more tanks and build-up than expected, but that he would drive them back into the sea that night. On June 8th, Rommel was again asked what went wrong. His recorded reply, "Against any other troops in the world but the Canadians, we'd have driven this invasion into the sea." From the beaches of Normandy, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles began moving to Caen, which had become the focus of attention. Since their landing, over 450 Little Black Devils had become casualties, and they had to be rebuilt. The Battle of Carpiquet was next, and it was considered to be the most heavily defended area of the Con defenses. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles' objective was to capture the airfield. The performance of the regiment in this hornet's nest can best be described as one of endurance. They repeatedly attacked this heavily fortified airfield, defended by fanatical troops. Few regiments could have succeeded under the trying conditions experienced by the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. The regiment saw 132 Little Black Devils fall at this airfield. Of this total, 40 would never rejoin the regiment. From July 7th to 16th, the capture of Caen was about to unfold with the plan known as Charnwood. The Rifles were sent forward to stem the enemy's push. At one point, for nearly 2 hours, hand-to-hand fighting ensued. As the Caen battle now drew to a close, the regiment had a chance to reorganize. The Little Black Devils took the opportunity to relax. On July 27th, the Americans managed to break the enemy's defense. Patton's forces pushed the enemy back to the Falaise area. The Canadians and Americans struck southwards in a coordinated attack to trap the bulk of the German army. During Operation Totalizer, August 8 to 12, as the Canadians advanced, the Germans began to fight desperately. The Rifles boarded trucks for the front line. During the next 2 days, the Rifles moved forward, following the general advance. On August 12th, they went forward to relieve some Polish infantry. In the previous few days, the enemy had been fighting rearguard actions with determined skill and ferocity. Each yard had been contested bitterly. The enemy was not to be persuaded. The struggle would continue at a tenuous pace. The companies moved at midnight, August 12th, into their forward positions until they were ready to take on the Jerrys. Throughout the night, severe shelling rained on the forward positions and continued during the day. The drive to close the Falaise Gap was hard fought and was a strategic battle in winning the war. Some of the heaviest and hardest fighting of the war happened between Normandy and the Falaise Gap. My Uncle Andrew was a sniper and a Bren gunner, and after 4 years overseas would have been a well-trained, experienced soldier. It is a little-known fact that the German army supplied methamphetamine to its soldiers. The Canadians talked about the strength of the Germans and how hard they fought, never seeming to tire. They were a more formidable foe for the Canadians because they were on speed. Imagine how much harder our soldiers had to fight because the enemy was on a drug that gave them superhuman strength. This is further testimony to their bravery and courage. On August 19, 1944, my grandparents received the telegraph. Minister of Natural Defense deeply regrets to inform you that H20547, Rifleman Andrew Richard Smith, has been officially reported wounded in action on a date not yet available and died of wounds 12 August 1944. If any further information becomes available, it will be forwarded as soon as received. On September 26, 1944, my grandparents received a follow-up letter to clarify Andrew sustained a shell fragment wound on the 12th of August, 1944, which caused his death on the same day. It would seem to confirm that he had died on the last day of Operation Totalizer. My granny received the Canada Memorial Cross, or Mother's Cross, as it is also known. It was given to the mothers of sons killed in action. Andrew's name and ID number is inscribed on the back. Our family nearly lost this medal. I was alerted that this medal was for sale on eBay, and we paid a hefty price to bring it back into the family. The other badge is the hat pin of the Little Black Devils. I remember my Grandpa Wellington as a quiet man. I can hardly recall him talking, and certainly I never had any real conversations with him. In one of the war records we reviewed, he had written a note, and I quote, "He," meaning Andrew, "also had in his billfold that he was keeping for souvenirs as it had traveled with him a lot since he was at Quebec in December 1940, one $10 bill and $1 bill. If at all possible, could I have that back, just as it is, as I want it for a keepsake, and do not want it in a check. Today, Earl Radai will tell you the story of his wife's mother, Irene, during wartime. Irene is my dad and Andrew's cousin. They all grew up and lived within sight of each other in our neighborhood. I know many of the neighborhood gatherings that my grandparents attended were at Irene's house. I recall Irene telling me the story that at one gathering, shortly after receiving news of Andrew's death, they had been singing one of the war songs, and my granny burst out crying. My grandpa was 45 when Andrew died. My granny was 41. My dad was 16. How stoic everyone had to be during a time of great sadness in our families, neighborhoods, and communities. It is our common ground to remember and share these stories and to never forget. In my little neighborhood of approximately 20 families, I can recall my granny's brother, Ernie Jones, who was captured at Dieppe and ended the war as a POW, struggling with alcohol for the rest of his life. I remember our next-door neighbor, Bill Murphy, who lost a leg in Sicily. Bill was a wonderful, friendly, kind man. I clearly recall knocking on his door to call on his kids to play, and Bill yelling, "Come on in." Bill usually sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of rum and would say to me, "Come on in and have a drink." I was only about 11 years old. Then he would laugh, and his wife Winnie would just roll her eyes. It is interesting to note that when I spoke to Bill and Ernie's families for information and to ask their permission to share my memories of them, they both said they didn't know a lot because they never talked about it. These are a few of the stories I remember in our neighborhood. I'm sure every family had a similar story. Of 7 brothers, my dad's brother Cliff also served overseas, and upon returning home, made the Army his career. My Army brat cousin Marg, Cliff's daughter, talks about her family had a hard life because of Cliff's behavior. She believes it was, in part, as a result of her dad's time overseas that made him the kind of man she remembers as a father. My cousin Marg and her husband Rocky made the trip from Winnipeg today to hear Andrew's story. These men and women saw and lived through horrible experiences and suffered unimaginable trauma. They came back with PTSD before we even knew what that condition was. There was no diagnosis and therefore no treatment. They suffered in silence. For many, the pain was dulled by alcohol, and they just got on with their lives. No one talked about what they endured. That's the way it was back then. I think we should never forget and always remember the pain and heartache our families and neighbors struggled through. The history of these wars should be mandatory in our schools. The saying is that if we don't study history, or we are bound to repeat it, we need to ensure that history is learned. My partner and I had the privilege of visiting Andrew's grave on an overseas visit in 2000. It was one of the most moving experiences of my life. I was the first family member to see Andrew's grave. My son Shad had visited Andrew's grave in 2016. My granny and grandpa never got to see their son's final resting place. One of my deepest regrets is that I never had a conversation with my granny about Andrew. It is incredibly sad that because of the culture of not talking about the war and their losses, people like my grandparents suffered their heartbreak alone and in silence. On the steps of the War Museum in Normandy, we met a war vet from Toronto, traveling with a fellow vet from London, England, and their wives. It was the first time he had been back since the war, and he related to us how his best friend had been shot and died 15 inches from him while they were crawling on their bellies across the beach. We told him our story. He said it made him happy that younger people were not forgetting. We ended up all crying together on those steps. In 2008, the year of Keewatin's 100th birthday celebration, I lobbied the Keewatin Legion and helped them bring to fruition a plaque beside the cenotaph in Beatty Park with the names of the Keewatin boys that didn't come back from the wars. A plaque where we could run our fingers across the names of our loved ones in remembrance. Keewatin, a proud war history that on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month says out loud the names of all those that didn't come home. We often find old family letters in our lives. My talk today was about my Uncle Andrew's letters from the war. The story was not fully told in these letters or to the family, but gave the clues that allowed a next generation of family members to link the history now available to the story of his last days. My Uncle Andrew never got to come back home. He didn't get to have a family, to be a neighbor, a member of the community. He never got to hunt or fish on the river with his dad again. He never got to experience the smell of his mom cooking bacon for his breakfast again. He never came back to walk the Slabtown Road, to enjoy the beauty of the creek and the river. My dad never saw his brother again. My Uncle Andrew's story doesn't differ much from the many, many wartime stories. It is not much different than that of the other boys and men that went overseas. It is the common story of all our families and neighbors during a difficult and sad time. The beauty of my neighborhood overwhelms me. I know how fortunate I am to enjoy the sunrises and the sunsets on the river. I sometimes think of my Uncle Andrew and I feel sadness for his suffering and that of all our families during that time. I understand that I have privilege because of the sacrifices they made. It's important that at the going down of the sun and in the morning, we shall remember them.